Okay, thank you all for joining us today. My name is Laura Saucier. I'm a wildlife biologist with the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, and I'm the coordinator of the Piping Plover and Least Tern project here at DEEP. And we're very excited to have you on board as new volunteers, helping us monitor our piping plover, least tern, oyster catcher, and common tern populations here in Connecticut. So I know that as a new volunteer, this format's not ideal, but these are strange times we're in. So bear with us, and we will we'll hopefully be able to join you out in the field and help you with any questions you may have as you conduct your monitoring activities. So, all right. Okay, so I'm going to be talking primarily about piping plovers and least terns because that's my purview. My colleague Corey Folsom O'Keefe will be talking about oyster catchers. So don't be surprised if I spend a lot of time on two birds. There's that third bird coming. So my presentation objective is to teach you about the life history of these two birds, how we manage these two birds in Connecticut, and how we conduct monitoring. So actually, I should point out, for those of you who may not have seen a piping plover, this is a piping plover. It's about the size of a robin, and they are returning back to Connecticut as we speak from their wintering grounds down in southern United States and into the Bahamas. And so I'm going to talk to you about why we're all gathered here learning about piping plovers. So this bird is a federally threatened species and was listed to the Federal Endangered Species Act list back in 1986. Just to let you know, there's two different populations of this bird in North America. One kind of group, part of the population nests on the Atlantic coast, and part of another population, nests out in the Midwest. Interestingly, along sandbars on large rivers like the Platte River and the Missouri River. So we here on the Atlantic coast, these are, coastal species. They specialize on coastal foods, coastal foraging, whereas the Midwest population has different behaviors. They focus on riverine species and riverine habitats. So it's also a state threatened species here in Connecticut. So it receives protections not only under the Federal Endangered Species Act, but also the State Endangered Species Act. It was included on our list back in 1992. And the reason for its inclusion is that it was in the literature out there once deemed to be a common summer visitor. And what happened was populations declined, noticeably declined. So there was three reasons for why we think those populations declined. One has to do with the unregulated harvest for the hat making industry. So, back in the day when high-end ladies' fashion included hats with egret plumes and different feathers and whatnot, these were one of the birds that those feathers were taken from. With the introduction of harvest limits and just outright bans on hunting of certain species, those populations somewhat recovered, but then we saw another dip in their numbers, and that was associated with increased shoreline development, and that is something that is continues today. And the third reason is just human disturbance. So the anyone who's been to a beach in the middle of June or July knows that these are busy places with lots of people doing lots of different things. So these birds are habitat specialists. They need beaches. So therefore, human disturbance is kind of that nagging issue and kind of hampers recovery of the species. So just to give you a little bit of, I guess, perspective from like what the Fish and Wildlife Service thinks. The Fish and Wildlife Service would consider this species, you know, quote unquote, recovered, like that we had recovered the species. If in the Northeast, so from Virginia north to Maine, if we had a population of piping plovers of 600 pairs, and we could sustain those numbers for like a number of years. You know, kind of compare that with back in 1986, census efforts only yielded about 553 pairs on the entire Atlantic coast. So, you know, from maritime Canada down to North Carolina, only 500 pairs were documented. So it's kind of a bit of a matter of scale there. But so Connecticut's recovery goal, and it's a squishy recovery goal, but for the most part, we think if we can sustain about 40 pairs, we're doing pretty good. Our 10-year average has been 53 pairs. So our efforts here in Connecticut have been pretty good. These birds are returning back and doing pretty well. So a little bit about the Endangered Species Act of 1973. So this is the federal act. The purpose of this is to protect and recover imperiled species and their ecosystems. So for every species that is put on that federal list, scientists have to come up with a recovery plan, basically a cookbook for how the heck we're going to get this done. Also included in the Endangered Species Act is the statement that take will be prevented. So the term take is it's defined as harassing, shooting, hunting, wounding, trapping, killing, et cetera, or any attempt to do so. So this act prohibits take without a federal permit. Obviously, a federal permit would be something that would be very difficult to get. So it's pretty much, yeah, somewhat a prohibition on the take of this species. One kind of sticky wicket here is that this act has limitations. It has very limited authority on private property, which is something that if you're doing monitoring in Connecticut, you have to be very much aware of, because most of our birds settle down on municipal beaches. So, and for the most part, we have pretty good cooperation with the towns for many of these breeding sites. But there are situations where these birds settle on private property, and they don't necessarily have to protect the bird as much as we would do so on state and municipal land. So I guess just keep that in mind. So we here at DEEP, we work with other state agencies, towns, private landowners, federal agencies, volunteers, academics, NGOs, all to protect this species where it occurs in our state. So a little bit about piping plover and least tern habitat. So Connecticut has about 80 miles of open sandy beach habitat. And, you know, by nature, that habitat is narrow. In Connecticut in particular, it's fragmented and highly developed. And as I mentioned before, you show up at a beach during the summer and you'll see that it's intensively utilized by many different competing user groups. So these birds are, like, as I mentioned, are returning back to Connecticut. I heard that we've got one of our first ones showing up yesterday. Excuse me, was it yesterday? Wednesday, sorry. And as I mentioned, these birds spend the winter, South Carolina, Gulf Coast, Bahamas, and return back in March to breed. So they are sandy beach habitat specialists. They are not going to move to anywhere else. They've evolved to live in this habitat. They have cryptic coloration, while it may not look like it, because this picture right next to this picture shows, a bird with an orange beak and striping, and it seems like it shouldn't be cryptically colored. But if you look on the picture to the left, within that red circle, there is a piping plover there. And the red area that I circled is the breeding, like the nesting habitat for this species. It's highly specific. If beaches in general are, narrow, the band that this bird chooses to nest in is even more narrow. It's this sweet spot between the high tide line, above the high tide line, but yet below heavy vegetation. So, and where I have circled is pretty much that sweet spot. And if you've ever walked a beach in Connecticut, that tends to be where people like to walk as well. So we have an inherent conflict right there. But if you haven't seen piping plovers out in the wild, the males and females do look a little bit different. The males have, they look similar, but when you see them paired up, you'll notice these differences. The males will have like this heavier black collar around their neck. And they will begin nesting in late April, mid to late April. So their nest, as I mentioned before, this bird is cryptically colored. It is evolved to use camouflage to avoid predators. Same with their eggs. Those eggs are very cryptically colored. This photo makes it look like they might be fairly obvious, but when you're on a beach, very difficult to see these eggs. So the nest, it's not like you would think of like a robin nest that's made with grasses and whatnot. A nest for a piping plover is just a small depression in the sand that the males dig, and the female lays 4 eggs, one every other day until she has 4, and then they begin incubating full time. So the strategy behind incubation, like laying eggs and not incubating right away, is that when you do start incubating when you do start incubating full time, those chicks are all the same developmental phase when they hatch, versus something like an eagle, where the female starts incubating as soon as the first egg is laid, and as those chicks hatch, there's a developmental difference between the chicks. And in that scenario, it's usually the most developed chick survives, but this is a different strategy. So once those 4 eggs are laid, the parents begin incubating full time. So incubation duties are shared by the pair, and as I mentioned before, delayed until all 4 eggs are laid, and those eggs will hatch within 27 days. After this 27 days, the eggs will hatch, and we have the chicks are called precocial chicks, which basically means once they hatch and dry off, they're up and running. They are moving around the beach. They're not like warblers where the parent brings food back to them. Once they're hatched, they're on the go. And these chicks stay with their parents through migration. And often the chicks stay with the male through migration and follow the male down to wintering grounds, whereas the females will split off and actually migrate oftentimes a little bit earlier than the male with the chicks. So these chicks will go from this little fluff ball with those tiny little wings, and in 27 days will have developed enough to begin flying. And it's within these 28 days that things are kind of hairy because you have little chicks running around. the beach, and they're really susceptible because they can't fly out of harm's way. So these birds, after they're first hatched, spend a lot of time foraging in the rack line. For those folks that, if you've never heard of the term rack, it's basically the line of debris that forms on the beach as the tides come in and out. So if you're looking at a beach that hasn't been beach groomed, you'll typically see 3 lines of debris, and one is for the high tide, one is mid tide, and one is low tide. So those chicks spend a lot of time foraging in that rack until they are a little bit more developed and can get down to intertidal zone to start foraging in the mud flats more so. They eat invertebrates, and as I said, beach rack is really important for the first days of their lives. So as you can imagine, beaches that do a lot of beach grooming, this could be problematic for this bird. So I promised I'd talk about least terns as well. So least terns, much like the piping plovers, they share nesting habitat. They have this same nesting habitat preferences. So much like the piping plover, there is an actual internal population of least terns that, again, nest on sandbars in larger rivers. And that interior population is actually a federally threatened species, whereas our Atlantic coast population is not federally listed. But this species is a state threatened species. So these birds arrive a little bit later than piping plovers. So they're arriving in the beginning of May. And oftentimes what happens is these a colony, and they're colonial nesters. They nest together. It's a survival strategy for, watching out for predators and that sort of thing. So these birds will show up in groups, and oftentimes will settle in around our piping plover nests. So least tern nests, they lay 1 to 3 eggs. Similarly, they have very cryptically colored eggs, similarly to the piping plover, cryptically colored eggs. Also used just a small scrape in the sand as a nest. And these birds, as I mentioned, are colonial nesters, and they are feisty. So they're very, very protective of their nests and their chicks. So different than the piping plover, these terns bring food back to their chicks. So these chicks are not running around the beach like piping plovers will be. So areas that we kind of manage for nesting shorebirds, I worry less about least tern chicks than I do piping plover chicks, which, those piping plover chicks are more susceptible to getting stepped on than I think least tern chicks, because for the most part, we tend to kind of cordon off the nesting area for least terns, and because they're not moving around, they're not going to get stepped on as easily. But for those of you who have not ever had the delight of seeing least terns in action when they're worked up, if a perceived predator gets too close to their colony, they will start being defensive. They will start dive bombing you. They will poop on you. They will throw up on you. They are not subtle about wanting you out of the area. So if you ever start getting dive bombed by least terns, it usually means that you are too close to their nests or their young. So least tern chicks, the first few days, basically spend a lot of their time just trying to get out of the sun and avoid predation. Things like gulls will take least tern chicks readily. So predation is very much a conservation challenge for shorebirds. And but I kind of have two different ways of thinking about predators. They're the predators that are naturally going to be in a coastal ecosystem, things like gulls and black-crowned night herons and peregrine falcons, bobcats. Those are predators that are already there on the beach looking for food. And I would call those natural predators. And then there's this kind of group of predators that I coin human subsidized predators. These are the predators that are being drawn to coastal areas because of things like garbage that people leave behind. So garbage is a conservation challenge, trying to work with landowners and municipalities to ensure that they're not leaving garbage around, or having receptacles that can responsibly handle garbage is important. As you can see, both these pictures, you've got nests right here. These are right near nesting areas. And there's also the additional, potential entanglement issue with too much garbage being out on the beach. So another conservation challenge for the piping plover and least tern are dogs. These are our pet dogs. Your dog, as cute and awesome as it may be, when on a beach, is perceived as a predator by these shorebirds. Leashed or unleashed, the piping plovers in particular will react to the dog's presence, and they don't see your dog any different than a fox or a coyote. So this is a big challenge for you as a monitor. You're going to be seeing this a lot in how you handle that, and it is often people often treat dogs as much like they treat their children, and they get defensive when you remind them that, hey, dogs aren't supposed to be on this beach. So just to prepare you for that. And dogs are also kind of rolled into this human disturbance conservation challenge. So human disturbance, it's, we've always been at the beach. That's not a problem. The issue, I think, is just all of the different ways that we utilize beaches, and understanding that it's cumulative impacts. So things like the beach season, fishing, kite surfing, walking your dog, kayaking, volleyball games, just strolling the beach, camping, all these things together, it's kind of like death by 1,000 cuts. It's just every little thing has kind of an impact. And interestingly, there's been some studies done on what is the actual cost of disturbance. And there's a study done that actually the findings are that there's actual physical ramifications to birds that are disturbed. And it makes sense too. I mean, you think about it from a human perspective, anything that stresses us out, we have lower immune responses, we have changed behaviors, we don't necessarily take care of ourselves as we should. And if you want to think about it kind of in that way, all of these behaviors disturb these birds. So anyhow, this study basically looked at birds that were choosing disturbed areas versus birds that chose areas that were either had just less areas that had less human disturbance, and they found that the birds that were in these disturbed areas actually had lower weights and poorer body conditions. So and for the nesting sites, these all these disturbances, the birds are reacting to us. They are spending time either hopping off their nest to try and escort us away because they perceive us as predators. And if they're hopping off their nest all the time, reacting to people, they're not able to incubate their eggs as they should. And every time they hop off that nest, a predator could come down and grab an egg, or they're more susceptible to getting their eggs predated by hopping off, and also just those eggs are potentially at risk of exposure. And after those chicks hatch, if these sites have so much human disturbance, the parents are spending more time just reacting to all these different disturbances, and they're not spending the time they need to tending their chicks. So you have situations where if the parents are trying to deal with a perceived predator issue, those chicks are at risk of getting picked off by the gull that's waiting because they're smart. And so anyhow, death by 1,000 cuts. So here in Connecticut, how do we manage piping plovers? So since 1984, we've been monitoring sites, statewide, Greenwich to Groton, and there's between 13 and 19 sites. And as I mentioned before, lots of competition between recreation and bird nesting at almost all of these sites. So our main tool for management in Connecticut, which might be funny, is just stake and string. So we use these wooden stakes here, and we use twine, and we kind of cordon off, areas that we think the birds are going to show up and nest in. And these areas we shift them and move them depending on where the birds actually do settle down, but it's called string fencing, it's called psychological fencing, it's called symbolic fencing, it's called stake and twine fencing. It all means the same thing. It's being utilized to, again, cordon off important areas so that you don't get lots of walking and disturbance within those areas. It sets up kind of a quiet area for those males to set up their nesting territories. And it protects people as well from inadvertently stepping on eggs or chicks, which, I don't really think anyone wants to do. So sometimes when people get upset about how much area we've cordoned off, I've pointed out that it's a protection for not only the birds, because it creates a buffer between, the beach activities and the birds that are trying to incubate, but it also protects people from doing harm, because again, they are cryptically colored birds. It is difficult to see them and find them. So this string fencing, we try and get it up beginning of April. Depends a lot on the weather, but having it up kind of early in the season, again, ensures like a quiet area for those birds to establish territories. So another thing that we kind of consider when deciding which tools we're going to use is we manage shorebirds based on how they behave, and you'll see that a little bit more when I talk about these terns. But piping plovers, they're birds, they can fly, but they spend a lot of time on the beach walking around, and they're one of their main ways of dealing with perceived predators, including us, is to escort us away from their nesting territory. So as you do more monitoring of this bird, you'll start to notice when you're walking along the string fence, a bird will ahead of you will kind of hop up and kind of be in front of you and kind of look at you. And as you get closer to that bird, it's going to start kind of like walking just a little bit ahead of you, basically kind of escorting you out of its nesting territory. And once you're beyond what it feels, whatever distance it feels safe, it will return back to its nesting activities. Another thing that we keep in mind is these birds will use a broken wing display, and you may have seen this with things like killdeer or other birds. It's a commonly used display, but if again they see us as predators, if I'm walking along a beach and I see a piping plover in front of me that's doing this broken wing display, it's kind of fluttering around, it's making very pitiful noises, and it's very obviously trying to get my attention. That bird is not hurt. That bird is trying to protect something, and usually it means that there's either a nest or there's chicks around. And the whole reason for this is if it starts flopping around like that, if you are a predator, it will, and you have the choice between a small little chick or a meaty parent, you obviously would make the choice to go after the meaty parent, and that bird is going to lure you away from its chicks, and then as soon as it deems things safe, it will hop up and either run away or just fly off, and you'll know that it was just trying to pull you away. The second tool that we use for managing these birds is nest exclosures. So a nest exclosure is basically a circular fence that we put around a nest, and it has bird netting on top. And the width of the wires on the fencing, the birds can easily walk through. So it's not like we're fencing them in; they can pass in and out as needed. But the whole point of this fencing is to protect the eggs from being eaten. So it's kind of it ensures that eggs can at least hatch. So really it keeps most things out. Rats and weasels are the exceptions, and they can get through get through the fencing. And we use these judiciously. We don't fence off every nest, and because we do understand that it is stressful for the birds, but in situations where we want to kind of bump up our hatching success, it raises the hatching success up to like 96% versus much lower in wild conditions. So anyhow, we put exclosures around complete nests, which basically means all 4 eggs have been laid. Again, it keeps people and predators are out. It's pretty big. We bury the bottom to keep skunks from trying to dig under, and we put netting on top to keep the gulls out. After the chicks hatch, those exclosures are not revisited by these birds. The birds don't view them as any type of shelter or protection. So once the eggs hatch, those birds are out of there. They don't use them, and we tend to pull those exclosures down and use them, for the next nest or whatnot. But after those eggs hatch, those chicks, as I mentioned before, are highly susceptible to being stepped on, eaten until they are developed enough to fly, which is that 28 days. So I do have to say one interesting thing about chicks and why it's kind of so precarious when they're first running around is that because they are using coloration and behavior to avoid predators, these chicks oftentimes will not move out of the way if someone's walking, because they're hardwired to just stop and stand still and try and blend in with the background. And unfortunately, that can be problematic if there's vehicles on the beach, or the beach is being groomed, or there's just high beach volume. So these terns, a little bit different philosophy. These birds, they're not walkers like piping plovers. They fly in, they fly out. They're like fighter jets. So an exclosure becomes an obstacle for them. So we don't use nest exclosures for these terns. String fencing, or that psychological fencing, is the primary tool that we use for tern colonies. And every once in a while, if we have an area that we think needs it, we will set up like a large fenced off area, and that's just kind of minimizes the number of raccoons and skunks that are going to be trying to, maybe not raccoons, but skunks for sure, trying to get in there. But it's a lot of work, and it's not something that we have the resources to do every year. But you can tell from this photo up here that, you know, if that fence wasn't there, all those people would be in there. So the fourth tool that we use to manage piping plovers and least terns here in Connecticut is monitoring. And this is where you come in. And I would argue it's maybe, it's just very important. And why? You know, your function as you go out and monitor piping plovers and least terns for us is you're going to be collecting data. You are our eyes and ears. You're letting me know how many chicks you're seeing, and which pair you think that those chicks belong to. You're letting me know if people are walking their dogs off leash. You're letting me know if someone has ripped down all of my string fencing. You're letting me know just what's going on. And also your activities while you're out there. We're not law enforcement, but it gives kind of an enforcement presence. I think that it gives the illusion that people are out there and watching, because people are out there and watching. And I think it maybe, I think that people kind of pick up on, oh, wow, these are important. And, you know, maybe someone only visits the beach like once or twice a summer, and they may not even know that birds nest right on the beach. So having people out there watching, taking notes, you know, talking with people, answering their questions about the birds, I think is really important. And it's a good, you know, teaching moment for the folks that are out on the beach. So, and with you all out there, it helps me on holiday weekends like Memorial Day weekend and 4th of July weekends, which are, Memorial Day weekend tends to be a big weekend for nests being laid, and July 4th weekend is just, there's usually a lot of chicks running around. So, and I usually need people out there keeping an eye on things for me. So Connecticut meets our recovery goals, that 40 or so pairs that we can support. We get more than that most years, because we have an enthusiastic, experienced, and extensive monitoring network, which I hope you all will join us. You are the heart and soul of plover recovery here in Connecticut. And I do have to say that talking with states around me, you know, Massachusetts, Maine, etc., we do amazing compared with other states. So, and I really, you know, that's all the people that spend their time volunteering to look after these birds. That's really the success that Connecticut has. So, monitoring, how it's done. For those of you who have never done piping plover monitoring, we will hopefully have a training in April or May to kind of help you, for those folks that are brand new to this. There's definitely an art and science to it, and the more you do it, the better you get at it. But basically what we would like you to do when you're out monitoring is, you know, walking the beach and looking for piping plovers under good weather conditions only. If it's cold and windy and raining, you shouldn't be out there, and the birds shouldn't, you know, we don't want to be adding to the disturbance to those birds during, you know, stressful environmental conditions. So if it's poor weather, stay home. And we'd like you to let us know if our signs and fencing are up and adequate. Sometimes, you know, birds will set up a nest outside of our string fencing, so letting us know that we need to expand that string fencing. is important. Checking on the location and activity of plover pairs, like whether they're incubating or whether the chicks have hatched and are, you know, running around the beach. That's important. How many chicks are you seeing is important. And after we set up the string fencing, we don't want anyone in the string fencing. You know, people are watching, and I think that if our volunteers are in the string fencing, it sets up, you know, it doesn't look good. So we want to lead by example. So if you attend our training session, we'll talk about the best places to walk so that you know that you're not going to be stepping on nests. Again, you've got heavy vegetation, you have this dry sand, which is your nesting area, and then you've got wet sand. If you're ever in doubt as to what's going on, I would always recommend walking in the wet sand and using binoculars to look up at the dry sand areas for birds. So while you're out walking the beaches, you always want to be aware of species-specific behavior. You know, is this piping plover escorting you down the beach? If so, that probably means that it has, you know, eggs or chicks nearby. Is it using a broken wing display? If so, then it means that you are pretty darn close to something that it's protecting. And if you're ever in that situation, my recommendation would be to just step back and walk towards wet sand, because the birds are not nesting in wet sand. So, you know, just back away from the broken wing display. Is Elise Tern dive bombing you? Like, are you feeling like they're dive bombing you? Well, that probably means you are too close to them. And in that situation, I would say back away towards the wet sand. So education, part of monitoring is talking with people, you know. You can, and here in Connecticut, we have a share the beach philosophy. We don't shut down beaches. We don't have the authority to shut down most beaches just because birds are nesting there. So what we're really trying to do is just instill this culture of sharing the beach. The beach is habitat too, that these birds just can't move to a tree. You know, they've evolved to nest on beaches. So while you're out there, you know, just reminding people to respect the signs and cordoned off areas. Depending on the beach, some beaches, you know, don't even allow dogs during the summer, like reminding them that dogs are not allowed on the beach. Certainly talk to them about the birds positively. You know, many people don't know anything about the birds, and you know, we're humans, we're egocentric, and you know, I think having someone talk positively about them, you know, makes a difference. And really the message that I try to give people, especially when they're doubtful of, you know, oh my goodness, what are you doing out here? Why are you blocking off parts of the beach that people could be using? My message to them is just that all these birds really need is just a little time and space to raise their families. You know, it's very much a message that I think humans understand, and I shamelessly use it to advocate for the birds as well. So that is about all I have for the life history and management of piping plovers and least terns. And at this point in our presentation, we would have a law enforcement officer here to talk to you about the things that you're going to see on the beach. So for the most part, you're out there collecting data for us and being our eyes and ears. But every so often, you know, as you're talking to people and educating them, you will get kind of that bad apple, that person that is rude and disrespectful and doesn't care if their dog's off leash, doesn't care if their dog is chasing birds. You've got people that, you know, vandalize our equipment. We have people that, you know, throw things at the birds. We have people that chase the birds, grab the birds. And these are protected birds. They are protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and they are also protected by not only the federal but state Endangered Species Acts. So it's not a free-for-all. There are rules when it comes to potentially harming these birds, and I want you to understand that you know, you may run into folks, and you may end up having to call law enforcement if someone is trying to harm the birds. So our webinar isn't very conducive to having our law enforcement person here. We're hoping that when we have a field training that an officer will come up and talk to you about this concept. But you know, the first thing they're going to do is tell you to consider your safety at all times. It's your highest priority. You know, don't hesitate to call 911 if you feel unsafe. If you are in a safe situation and you see someone trying to harm the birds, we urge you to contact the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection's Environmental Conservation Police. For short, we call them ENCON. And this number is going to be throughout your packet of information and is on your badge as well, so you don't have to take too many notes here. And all of this information is going to be in your volunteer packet as well. So again, you don't have to scribble notes. But if a conflict or hostile situation arises, we recommend that you diffuse the situation by, you know, if someone says, well, who are you? Why are you telling me what to do? You know, you can explain that you're a deep volunteer piping plover monitor, and just explain that you're observing the birds for us. And if they have any questions, they can feel free to call me, and my number's there. Your response, you are not a law enforcement official. I am not a law enforcement official. All that we can do is relay beach regulation information, such as areas, you know, when we cordon off areas, those are closed areas. We can certainly say that dogs are not permitted during the nesting season, or those sorts of things. Oftentimes, you know, you want to do this in a positive manner, and, oh, hey, did you know that dogs weren't allowed here during the nesting season? You know, certainly doing it in a just not yelling at them, I guess, just being kind of informative is really the best way to go, because people really get their back up when approached by people, or also get their back up if they think that someone's trying to tell them what to do on their personal time. If you are trying to talk to someone and they are just not engaging with you, please just walk away. It's not worth it. You kind of have two groups of people. You have the people that don't know the rules, and then you have the people that know the rules but don't care. And if it's someone who just doesn't care, it's not worth your time or aggravation. Just keep on going. So should something happen, should you see someone throwing things at throwing rocks at the birds, or you know, their dog is chasing the birds, we want you to call ENCON, but we also want you to take a moment and kind of write down what you're seeing and what you saw. I'll include a form as part of your volunteer packet that kind of walks you through things that law enforcement will be looking for. So things like, if there were vehicles involved, description of the vehicles, description of the people, you know, set the scene. What was the date and time? What did you see? Where were you when it was happening? How far away were you from the person that was trying to throw rocks at the birds? What were the weather conditions? Was it, you know, a sunny day, or was it overcast and windy? Just write down as much as you can, because law enforcement, when they respond to you, are going to be looking for that information. And it's great if you have it available and that you've written it down while it's fresh in your mind. And certainly if someone has killed a bird, you don't want to disturb that crime scene. So you basically want to just back away and let ENCON get there. That way they can look for footprints and figure out like what happened. And that was what I had for being a good witness. We'll talk a little bit more about that during our field training, but and hopefully we'll get our law enforcement officer there to answer specific questions people may have. But I think for the most part, you're going to go out there and you're going to do your thing, but I'm not, there are situations where you, like I said, you have those bad apples that, you know, aren't following the rules and aren't playing nicely. So one thing I wanted to mention before I'm done, and is that some of our piping plovers have colored bands on their legs. I have some pictures here of birds that have bands on them. And these birds are part of scientific studies that are going on, trying to figure out where these birds are migrating to, where they're stopping over for during their migration back, you know, how I guess, do they return to the same areas to breed? Do they not? By being able to individually distinguish between these birds, you know, it helps us figure out kind of these questions that we have about them. So if you see a bird with bands, please, if you can take a photo, great. If you can't, if you can just describe what the color of the bands and what the bands look like, and send that to me, that's great. I can send that information to those researchers and help them with the research. So please, if you see this, report it to us. And at this point, I'm going to ask if anyone has any questions.
Laura, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. We did have some questions in the chat, so I didn't know if we just wanted to bring them up for the whole group if anyone didn't see. One of them was just about email updates, if anything changes, or if that was one of the questions that one of our volunteers asked. So I don't know if Scott, you want to take that up?
Or maybe when Scott, I'm assuming Scott will answer that once during his presentation.
Yeah, I think we should hold off until the end of exactly what Gloria and I do for
Okay.
kind of answering in the chat as it goes along. So we'll continue to do that. And then at the end, if there's really anything that we haven't touched, we'll do so then.
Okay.
Okay. So I guess I'll pull up my presentation on oyster catchers, and we'll go through that, and folks will continue just to be answering questions in the chat at the same time. Laura, can you see my PowerPoint? Well, everybody's on mute. I'm going to hope that everybody can see my
Visible,
PowerPoint.
Kari.
Excellent. Great. Thanks, Kathy. So another bird that you will see when you're out monitoring along the shoreline of Connecticut are American oyster catchers. Actually, I'm on the wrong slide. Let me start here. Okay. So there's our American oyster catcher. These guys are quite a bit bigger than piping plovers. They're probably more the size of a crow. And they're very distinctive, at least the adults are. So they're a pretty recognizable bird and pretty easy to locate, you know, when they're on sandy beaches. They do blend in a little bit better if they're on a rocky shoreline, you know, especially if their beak is maybe concealed and they're, you know, if they're, you know, nestled down, you know, kind of hiding it under their wings. But they are a pretty flashy looking bird. There are about 5,000 pairs of American oyster catchers across North America. And you can see sort of Connecticut, Massachusetts are sort of the northern end of their breeding range. Last year in Connecticut, we had 74 breeding pairs and we had 28 non-breeding pairs. And non-breeding pairs, we think are either sort of pairs that are young birds, so maybe just 2 or 3 years old and not really ready to breed yet. Or they might be birds that attempted to nest in March or early April and we just were not able to locate a nest. So we don't, you know, couldn't say definitively that they were a breeding pair. But overall, you know, we had, last year we had 204 birds, adult birds in Connecticut, which is pretty awesome. And their productivity was 0.86 fledglings per pair. The oyster catchers are similar to the piping plover in a number of respects. They arrive at about the same time. So we have at least 3 birds that we're aware of in Connecticut already. So arriving in March. They're typically nesting in April, similar to the piping plovers. Similar incubation period, 24 to 29 days, with both parents incubating. So they're hatching typically in about the middle of May. And their chicks are semi-precocial. So whereas piping plover chicks are precocial. And the difference is that oyster catcher chicks are mobile, they are feathered or downy. They are able to follow their parents around shortly after hatching, like a piping plover would. But they can't really get their own food. Oyster catchers eat oysters and mussels and clams. And for that food to be available to the chicks, the parents actually have to break open the shell and sort of expose the food, and then the chicks can eat the food. So that's why they're called semi-precocial versus full-on precocial. And these guys take about 35 days to fledge. So if we have a nest that's hatching in the middle of May, probably be early July that they'll be fledging. Like piping plovers, they will re-nest if their first nest isn't successful. So we can have oyster catcher raising young through the month of August, even into early September. Oyster catcher chicks are really camouflaged, unlike their parents. So if you look at this picture, there are actually 3 chicks in this picture. This was a picture from Bluff Point last year. And this adult had 3 eggs that had literally hatched that morning. So these are sort of freshly hatched chicks. And you can sort of see, especially the one on the right side of the parent, if that was just sort of curled up in the sand, it would be really hard to identify. So this is another species that uses the strategy of camouflage to sort of protect itself. And there are typically 2 to 3 oyster catcher eggs in each nest or clutch. Like I said, they take 35 days to fledge, and you can recognize the sort of young birds, even when they're full size, from the parents, because it does take them quite a while to sort of grow a full-size beak. You can see this is a young bird here on the left, another on the right, and then the adult is in the middle. So the beak isn't really full length at this point. All these birds are flying at that age, and they still have this black tip to their bill, which they'll keep through the winter months. So you can always sort of tell the first year oyster catchers from the adult oyster catchers. And the one neat thing about oyster catchers is they actually have 2 strategies for getting their food. The one strategy is the hammerers. So they will find an oyster or a mussel, and they will continue to hammer on the shell until they break it open. And then the other strategy is the stabbers. And these oyster catchers will stick their beak into the shell and cut the abductor muscle of the shellfish, and then it'll just pop open, and then they can eat the food. And if you have parents that are hammerers, then their chicks will be hammerers. And if you have parents that are stabbers, then their chicks will be stabbers. So they have some pretty neat strategies for getting their food. And because the chicks have to learn these strategies, they'll often stick with their parents for about a year. So they'll go with them down. They'll follow maybe one parent down to wherever they're spending the winter, and then maybe come back up north with them again in the spring. So this is typically where oyster catchers are distributed in Connecticut. So you can see they really are along the entire coastline from Greenwich all the way to Stonington. A lot of our oyster catcher nests are on offshore islands. So about 80% of the population last year was on offshore islands, and about 20% is on beaches. Some of the bigger concentrations are Kokini Island and the Norwalk Islands, the Westbrook Islands, and Sandy Point Island in Stonington. And these 3 locations, Laura talked about the different ways that we protect piping plovers. We don't put exclosures around oyster catcher nests, but they do benefit from string fencing. So they will often be nesting in the same string fencing where you have piping plovers and least terns on the mainland. And then at Sandy Point Island, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Rhode Island puts up the string fencing at Sandy Point Island. The McKinney Refuge puts out the string fencing at the Westbrook Bay Area Islands. And then the Audubon Alliance works with the town of Westport to put up string fencing on Kokini Island. So those are sort of the 3 islands that do get string fenced because those are kind of some of the larger concentrations of oyster catchers. But where we do have oyster catchers nesting on the mainland, we did have 16 pairs last year, and they produced 10 chicks. Having your eyes and ears on the beach really helps the oyster catchers out. You can, kind of keep an eye on them, talk to people about the things that they can do to help out our beach nesting birds, from not leaving trash on the beach to to not bringing their dogs on the beach, to sort of respecting the string fencing, that can make a difference. And last year, we did have 10 chicks fledge out of 16 pairs that were nesting at mainland sites. So a productivity of 0.66 on the mainland compared to 0.93 on the islands. The islands typically have a higher nesting success rate just because they're islands. There's less predators, there's less disturbance from people. So that's typically what's sort of why we think the birds are spending a lot of time out on islands. But it's great when we can have a year like last year where we were able to actually successfully nest along the shoreline too. So, hoping with your help that we're going to have another successful year of shoreline oyster catcher nests. One other thing I want to mention about oyster catchers before we turn it over to Scott is that we have a lot of banded oyster catchers in Connecticut. Audubon, Connecticut started an oyster catcher banding program in 2018. And since then, we've banded 24 birds and we'll be banding more this season. And our bands are yellow and have the letter T or N on them. And there's a metal USGS band on the lower part of the bird's leg, and then matching color bands on the top part of the bird's leg. And if you're out monitoring, we have bands on birds in all of the counties in Connecticut. So if you're out monitoring and you see an oyster catcher with bands and can get a good look at it through your binoculars, or maybe you have a camera with a zoom lens, if you are able to see what the band numbers are, or even if you can just tell what colors they are, because the color is actually helpful too, you can add that to your data when you're submitting your data. And Scott's going to tell you more about how to submit your data in just a minute. And I mentioned the colors can be helpful because yellow is the color for the Northeast. So Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island use yellow, but then orange is the color for New Jersey and New York. And then red is the color for Georgia. And then black is the color for some of the states on the Gulf Coast. So we do actually last week we had an orange bird show up at Milford Point. And we were able to look up that bird, and it was a bird that was banded as a fledgling at Nickerson State Park on Long Island, I think 3 or 4 years ago. So it was really neat to have that bird in Connecticut. Maybe it's a younger bird looking for a place where it will eventually nest. So kind of cool. And this is the time of year that any sightings that any information you guys can provide on banded oyster catchers is really helpful. It will help us understand if the birds that we've banded are returning to the same nest sites, if they're going to new nest sites. And then also birds that have been banded in other states, that might be passing through Connecticut. We really would love to get as much information as we can about banded oyster catchers. So if you see birds with bands and you're able to get the number or even just the color, definitely mention it when you submit your data. And then you can also mention it on the American Oyster Catcher Working Group webpage. So this page is actually set up to report American Oyster Catcher bands. So it's amoywg.org. And you can kind of go in, submit information on a banded oyster catcher, and then it will tell you where that bird was originally banded, if it's been seen at other sites during, since it was originally banded. And it will kind of let you you'll have a page of my oyster catchers. So the birds that you sort of observed and recorded. And it really is a great way to sort of kind of collect data on oyster catchers. If you're if you're going to be monitoring at a site like say Milford Point, where we do have a number of oyster catchers banded from 2018, if you can report, I would say report, if the color band maybe once a month, either the oyster catcher website or to your data. We don't necessarily need to know every single week, that N17 is still there, but it's good to at least on a monthly basis be sort of reporting, yep, I saw that bird. It's, this particular banded bird, it's still there. Either share that with us or share it with the Oyster Catcher Working Group website. And just wanted to share some exciting information that we've learned in the last 2 years. So this is some of the birds that were banded in 2018 and 2019, the place that they were banded in Connecticut, and then where they have gone over the winter months. So we've had birds, maybe go just a little bit south to Brigantine Island in New Jersey. We've had birds go down to sort of the southeast United States, to Deweese Island, Cedar Key in Florida, Tybee Island in Georgia, And then we actually have one bird, actually yellow N17 at Sandy Point, went down to the Gulf of Fonseca in El Salvador, which is really awesome to think about these birds making that voyage. And there's another bird also in Connecticut that was banded in Georgia many years ago that also goes down to the Gulf of Fonseca. So some of our birds are traveling just a little distance in the winter. Some of them are going quite a long distance. And it's really neat to sort of have this data and understand, if we want to be protecting oyster catchers, where are the places that we need to be sort of interacting with partners. I know that the countries around the Gulf of Fonseca now are sort of actively monitoring what oyster catchers and other shorebirds are coming through that area, and understand that it is a really important overwintering site for a lot of different shorebirds. So we're learning lots of cool things from oyster catcher bands. So definitely when you're out there, hope you were able to sort of report some of the oyster catcher bands. And I think that's the end of my presentation. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and definitely be sending questions through chat, and we'll pass it on to Scott at this point.
Okay. So for everyone, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this year. My name is Scott Krupash. I'm the Conservation Outreach Coordinator for the Roger Tory Peterson Institute. And for our purposes, I am the volunteer coordinator. So when you're interacting with us through ctwaterbirds@gmail.com, for the most often part of reporting information and data and receiving updates from us, you'll be interacting with me. We ask that all of you ideally volunteer at least 4 hours each month from April to August. This can vary at times, and often enough you might want to volunteer every week. More often, if you're out of school or if you're retired, it can depend, more on your schedule. It's very flexible. We're going to be observing and collecting data for piping plovers, least terns, American oyster catchers, which we've gone over well as common terns, which are another tern species that might occasionally nest on a beach. More often than not, you'll just see them foraging. You're going to report problems that you encounter, like Laura went over earlier, as soon as possible to us, whether it's with the birds, predators, or the public. You'll be educating beachgoers about our birds, questions about what's happening on the beach, why they shouldn't run their dog off leash, and so forth. And we'll have other volunteer opportunities arise as well, including fencing dates where we're going to ask folks to come out and join us to help in putting up the fencing and signage, checking on extra beaches in June to make sure we have seen all of our birds and none are hiding in spots that are less commonly used, or monitoring areas on the 4th of July around fireworks shows. Being a monitor is asking you to come out and volunteer and have fun, but it's also something that we take seriously because it affects the public perception of wildlife management and endangered species conservation. You have to have liability waivers and forms filled out with DEEP, which we will provide to you via email this year. We will ask that you wear a badge when monitoring, essentially a small ID card on a lanyard, which we will be mailing out this year since we're not in person. Volunteers should be neat in dress and appearance, and we're asking you not do things like go swimming and drink or smoke or partake in recreational activities while you're volunteering. This is kind of just focused on only monitoring and engaging the public. So when you go out, you'll want to make sure you have that volunteer ID card and lanyard. You'll want to have binoculars or a spotting scope. You want to have brochures and other outreach materials, which we will again provide to you as well. We'll give you details on that later. You want to have a sheet to take down notes as well as your phone. You might also want to have sunblock, backpacks and bags, jacket, hat, and gloves because it can often be cooler and windier at the shore, snacks or water, and insect repellent. For safety reasons for you and the birds, we ask that you only monitor on days where the temperature is above 50 degrees and below 90 degrees. The shore is often different. It's always good to take a look at the forecast and to check out where you're going instead of just going outside your house. You can monitor in pairs if you like, or with your family members or others who have signed up. And just keep in mind, you know, we don't want to go out when it's really raining, when there's thunderstorms possible or likely, and that you're going to be in remote areas walking often a mile or two or more. You're going to begin each survey by recording the weather, the time, the date, tide. You're going to look down the beach as much as you can before you head out to see what people are doing, where the birds are from the safest distance you can, and to scan everything just basically so that it's for your safety again and theirs. And you never want to enter into any of those symbolic fencing areas, because that in itself, you're causing a distraction to the birds, you might cause them harm, and you're also then showing people that we can go out there and we can, you know, go into these areas. And if they see that, then they're going to do that as well. You're going to record the behavior of the piping plovers and our other birds as much as possible, whether you see a pair together, you see birds feeding or walking around with young, you see incubation or a new nest. You're going to note the location of territories, and you're going to pay attention to where birds are leading you away from potentially chicks or a nest. You will definitely want to monitor closely and keep an eye on things, but you want to give enough space, and you want to limit your time in your areas, because we don't want to become more of a disturbance and cause any predation ourselves. If you find a new nest, you're going to look at the beach and try to make notes of what's there in the general location itself. If you have a phone, you can take a very far away shot, or a camera, again, a very wide and far away shot, and make notes later on to us about it. But you never want to mark it there in person, because either predators or people will see those objects or marks. Once the nest is exclosed, there's no need to keep tabs on the number of eggs. We don't need egg counts or anything like that. We will know how many are there, of course, with 4 for the most part. And when you are seeing birds incubating and coming up and flushing them off, again, we're causing more of a disturbance ourselves. We want them to be entirely left alone to their own devices, basically acting like they can't even know that we are there, or they don't even notice us. When a bird doesn't notice you or isn't paying you any attention, that's an ideal situation. If a nest appears to be abandoned or destroyed, you're going to email ctwaterbirds@gmail.com, and you'll contact Laura and Rebecca from Deep via email as well. We'll provide addresses again for everything. All of this is being recorded. All of this will be viewable again later. Everything will be sent to you as well. And the causes of these nests to be unsuccessful can be myriad, from high tides washing out, abandonment from disturbance, destruction, predators, people, and so on. If you do see signs of predators or sightings like gulls and crows trying to enter nests, or tracks from a fox, it's really, really helpful to note to us as well. Once the chicks have hatched, always just record the number of adults and chicks seen. We'll give you more information on how to kind of age and sex birds as we go along. For the most part, there are very helpful documents from Deep that can really break down how to kind of classify the age of piping plovers and least terns. Remember that, again, we want to minimize our disturbance to the birds as much as possible, and that maintaining that respectful distance is paramount. We will care far more about not being a disturbance to the birds ourselves than having all the exact precise data every day. We have staff, we have many volunteers, we have a lot of eyes out there, and we will piece it all together. All the information and the data that you have is great, but minimizing disturbance, number one. That's most important. If you see suspicious behavior or suspect the person may be responsible for destroying or harassing piping plovers of any kind, follow the good witness guidelines and call the CT Deep Encon Police, which will be on the important phone number sheet. When you're in a safe location, fill out the piping plover incident observation report, which again, all of this will be emailed to you. It will be available on our blog. It'll always be there, and we'll go through this many times. When you get home, sending Laura an email to let her know there was an issue and if it was resolved is great. And same with us, ctwaterbirds@gmail.com. Just the more you keep us in the loop about anything, the better. And educating beachgoers in friendly and informative, positive manners is always the most important. You can do as much or as little as you want. We're not asking or demanding that you go up to everyone and tell them everything. You don't need to relay all the regulations. You don't need to get into any hostile situations at all. But we definitely want to do what we can to make positive impacts. Monitoring, when it comes to scheduling, we'll be doing that now. And it's needed essentially April to August. So on April 1st, we're going to start trying to get out to our beaches and begin regular monitoring. It'll go through the birds' nesting season and their departure. They migrate through our area, start gathering in groups, moving around different areas in July and August. Some, depending on, again, how late seasons go. Sometimes you have nesting into July and August. We might have young through the end of the summer. It depends just on how successful things are, if they have to re-nest, how early or late they are. The times of high beach traffic are when we need you the most. Weekends, holidays, warm beach weather. And this year, of course, school has kind of paused for now. It might be interesting to see how many people are at the beach. We'll have to see what happens, and maybe more than normal. You're going to sign up for your schedule and your beaches, and we'll go over the beaches in a moment, by emailing ctwaterbirds@gmail.com with your requested schedule, which can be at a certain date of the month, a certain day of the week, every Tuesday in the morning at Long Beach, something like that. We keep it to AM and PM basically, because we don't need to go to exact times. It might differ if you're going at a certain tide, because going at low tide can be safer for the birds, for example. And we ask you to try to get these schedules to us by April 1st. If you need to alter it ever, that's fine. If you can't monitor at your time, something comes up, that's fine as well. We just ask you to let us know at ctwaterbirds@gmail.com so that we know you're not there. The available locations this year include Sherwood Island State Park in Westport, Pleasure Beach in Bridgeport, Long Beach, Russian Beach in Stratford, Milford Point and Silver Sand State Park in Milford, Sandy Morse Points in West Haven, Griswold Point in Old Lyme, and Bluff Point State Park in Groton. And traditionally, we need the most help at Long Beach, Milford Point, Sandy Morse Points, and Bluff Point. There may be a couple other beaches that we add, and a couple small spots like Waterford Town Beach. If they get a pair of birds, we'll have some help there. And if you're monitoring a Griswold Point, we'll be discussing that with the Nature Conservancy and kind of going over greater details because it's private. Data submission. We're asking you to submit your data via an electronic form. It's essentially a Google document that asks you for all the information that we are requesting. In that way, it prompts you to give everything that we need, so you don't have to wonder, oh, did I forget this? Oh, should I add that? The online data submission form is on our blog, which is located at ctwaterbirds.blogspot.com. And the forms are in the right-hand column under important documents. The online data submission form is the very top one. Once you open it, you'll see it's just a very simple web page. It'll say things like which species you saw, the date, the tide, the location, the number of birds broken down into adults, juveniles, fledglings, hatchlings, any nests, disturbances, and so forth. It's really straightforward. And once you do it a couple times, you'll be very accustomed to the data that you need to collect when you go out. If you have a problem with it, or otherwise, again, just email ctwaterbirds@gmail.com, and you'll find a lot else there too. If you eBird, you can do that by all means. It's still best to eBird and then go back and use the online data submission form. If you want to share checklists with us, you can do so at ctwaterbirds@gmail.com. If you have photos that need identification, other questions about monitoring, unknown sightings, you see a lot of disturbances on a more basic level, something that doesn't rise to the level of a take. Just, oh, there are a lot of kiteboarders today. There were a couple loose dogs, not near the birds, but just on the beach. Just let us know, ctwaterbirds@gmail.com, always helpful. Please do submit your data and information as soon as you can when you return from monitoring. The sooner you do, the more valuable it is, because we're doing this 7 days a week, every day going out there and assembling a picture of what goes on across Connecticut. So when you can come back and give us the clearest, most live picture of what happened at your beach, that's all the better. You know, we used to have data weeks later or months later. Folks would submit stuff at the end of the summers, you know, that would happen with Fish and Wildlife many years ago. And that's very limiting to what we can learn from it. We can get the general picture of it, but we can't address things live in real time. And the beauty of this alliance with all of our tremendous partners and colleagues and amazing volunteers is that we can address everything live. And we can do this, again, 7 days a week, 18, 20 hours a day, and stay on top of everything. And please do record your own time and hours always and submit that to us as well, because we want to know how much time you're putting into the project and the work. And thank you so much for everything. This presentation has been recorded. All this information, whether it's the documents, the details about how to report, the badge, everything will be sent to you. We'll be going over this. I'll be requesting you to send me, again, your schedules and your desired beach locations. You'll be sending me your physical address so that we can mail you a lanyard and a badge, and that we can send you other documents. And we'll go through everything online and have it all up and available in different places. This year is obviously a little different than normal, but for the most part, we're doing the same routines. And this is a great activity that you can do and just be outside on your own. And we can all keep communicating electronically, and we'll get through it all. And we have a couple weeks before really things get going with the birds intensively. So we'll have plenty of time to plan this all out. If you are going to monitor in West Haven, when you send me your information, you'll also want to send me your make of your vehicle, the model, and the license plate, because West Haven requires specific parking passes, which will be given out by the city and mailed to you, and then you can park there without paying. Other cities and towns, if you have our identification on you and you're clearly just going to monitor, you can say to Stratford or some of the state parks what you're doing, who you are, and here's your identification badge, and they'll let you in for free. If you ever have an issue with that, just let us know and let Laura know, and we'll address that. And here are some of the more detailed looks at our sites. There's Sandy Point right there in West Haven. There's Griswold Point and Hammonasset Beach State Park, which is where Hammonasset primarily just monitored by staff. So I know there's a couple sites people will ask me usually about that are monitored for myriad reasons only by staff members. And you'll see those in the updates, but they're not available to be monitored by volunteers. And that's Bluff Point State Park and Waterford. Harkness is another site that's monitored by staff. Sherwood Island State Park, Bikini Island is a staff monitored site being offshore. You have Milford Point, we have Short Beach, we have Long Beach, Pleasure Beach, we have Russian Beach around the corner there as well. And many of you know Stratford Point there, Silver Sand State Park. And let us know now in chat if you have questions, and we'll go through them as a group. Everyone will answer as much as they can. We're here to help. Thank you so much, everybody.
Yeah, so the chat box is available for questions. You know, some of the ones that we've had in the last few minutes were, you know, where do I send my message about where I want to monitor, and that would be to ctwaterbirds@gmail.com. That is the email address that for the bulk of questions, you know, anything you need to know that you reach out to. We've got some new questions coming up.
Hey, Corey.
Yes.
Oh, this is Laura. I just wanted to, I saw a question here about law enforcement, and I just wanted to address the difference between calling the local dog warden and calling the state ENCON folks. So NCON is really only going to be investigating situations where birds are harmed. And it could be a dog chasing birds down, but if it's a dogs off leash situation, those are municipal regulations that are supposed to be enforced by the dog warden or the town police. I know that our NCON folks are not staffed to the capacity where they can respond to dogs off leash in general, and in fact they cannot respond to municipal regulation. They can't enforce municipal regulations. So I guess just be aware if you have a dog off leash, in your information packet we have most of the dog warden phone numbers there. I would encourage you to call the town dog warden to let them know that there's an issue with loose dogs at the site that you're at. And you may not get a response from that dog warden, but certainly letting them know that there's a problem and when and where that problem is, I think is helpful. So if anyone has further questions, please let me know, because dogs are a big issue, and it's a squishy issue. So just contact me if you have issues.
Another question that just came through is, if I have extra time in a week, can I just go and monitor? And maybe Scott, you want to chime in on that one?
If you have extra time, you can, I would go over that with me on a one-on-one and incidental kind of basis, because if you regularly expect to have extra time, then we can kind of figure that out. But we want to know when you're going to be going to the beaches and when, and have it set somewhat, because we want to make sure there's a good spread of our folks and volunteers across all the times and places, because we don't want to overwhelm the birds either. It's good to have a lot of people out there, and it's okay to have overlap even, but at the same time, we don't want too many people going to the birds, because you end up hugging the birds a little too tightly, because we can, detract from their success as well. So just let me know, on an individual basis about that, and we can go from there.
Yeah, I noticed there was a question about Alewife Cove at Watertown Beach. And I was going to answer that question. So the plovers and terns, so that area is interesting. There's a lot of, between Ocean Beach and Waterford Beach, there's a lot of people in that cove. And I don't think Rebecca, our shorebird tech, is still on the line, but I think there are areas where there might be enough real estate for those birds to try and nest, but we found that there's just so much disturbance back there that it's unlikely, but never say never with these birds. So not used for nesting, but definitely used for foraging.
Okay, someone asked about what sort of special instructions they might be getting for Griswold Point. And basically what's going to be happening there is, so Griswold Point is owned by the Nature Conservancy, and Scott is kind of working with the bulk of volunteers, but the Nature Conservancy has their own volunteer coordinator, Martha Rice. And so what we're going to be doing is putting people in touch with Martha, and she'll help you kind of get to know the specifics of the site. Griswold Point is you have to be very conscious of the tide there, because at high tide you cannot get to Griswold Point. It's a spot that you have to go at low tide, or you can kind of go at mid tide if the tide is going out. You typically want to make sure you're there within like the sort of, say, 3 hours around low tide. If you try to go mid tide and rising, you're going to get stuck out there. So the TNC folks will definitely go over with volunteers the logistics of monitoring that site. It's a really cool site, but you just have to be really conscious of the tide. Okay, well, Laura, Scott, myself, Shelby, Beth, we're all going to be standing by, Stefan too, just to answer any additional questions that might come in. But we want to thank you all for participating in the webinar today. We're so excited to have so many new folks helping us out on the beaches this year. And, hopefully it's going to be an awesome season. So remember to email Scott at ctwaterbirds@gmail.com where you'd like to volunteer, what sort of day of the week, day of the month, AM, PM that you'd like to volunteer. And we will definitely be in touch and getting information to you. And once the season gets up and running, Scott will be sending about a weekly email with updates and information. So, but we're so excited to have your help this year. And thank you very much.